Do you know that story about the princess who sleeps for 100 years and only wakes up with a kiss? Well, what no one told you is that maybe she never wanted to wake up. What if her sleep wasn't a punishment, but a choice? What if, in that dream, she was more powerful than in the real world? Today, you'll discover a side of Sleeping Beauty that no one had the courage to show. But I need to warn you, after watching this video, you'll never sleep peacefully again, because sometimes those who sleep don't come back. And worse, maybe you've already entered her dream and didn't even realize it. Most people know the Hache, story of Sleeping Beauty as a fairy tale where a princess is cursed by an evil fairy. This curse causes her to prick her finger on a spinning wheel when she turns 16 and fall into a deep sleep that lasts a long time. This has always been seen as something bad, as if it were a cruel punishment. But was it really? There is another way to think about it. What if this curse wasn't really a punishment? What if it was a way to take the princess out of the real world for a reason that no one understood? It may seem strange at first, but sometimes something that seems bad can actually be protecting a person from something worse. Not all pain is destructive. Some things exist to prevent something even worse from happening. Perhaps the deep sleep wasn't a tragedy, but a kind of escape, a forced pause to avoid a future that would bring suffering. It's possible that the fairy knew something that others didn't. Maybe she saw what would happen to the princess if she continued living normally. Maybe she decided to do something drastic, not out of hatred, but because of something that needed to be avoided. This thought changes everything, because if the sleep was a disguised protection, then the curse becomes a difficult but necessary decision. It's no longer just a story of villainy. It's a story about control, about decisions that are made by someone who sees beyond what others can see. In the end, what seemed to be the end of the princess may have been the beginning of something bigger. Perhaps the curse was the only way to take her to a place where nothing could reach her. A place where she would be beyond the reach of threats. A place where silence would be safer than waking life. When someone goes into a deep sleep for many years, the expected reaction would be despair. The person would lose time, lose connections, lose their own life happening outside. But in Aurora's case, everything seemed different. The strange thing is that when she fell asleep, she showed no signs of fear. On the contrary, her face conveyed calm, as if this was exactly what she had expected. It makes one wonder, what if that sleep was not just a consequence of the curse, but something she truly accepted? It may be that she found in that moment a chance to escape from everything that was weighing her down. Waking up every day, following orders, dealing with people, faking feelings. All of this may have been tiring. Sleep in this scenario becomes a kind of relief. When she fell asleep, Aurora left behind the control that others had over her life. She left behind expectations. She left behind the roles that were expected of her. It was as if she had gained for a few seconds a moment of true freedom, a moment all her own, where no one else could tell her what to do. If she smiled as she fell asleep, it was no coincidence. It could have been the reaction of someone who finally felt at peace, someone who could not resist sleep, because the real light world for her no longer made sense. Perhaps what everyone saw as an end, for her, was the beginning of a different experience, something that only makes sense when you see beyond the surface. This detail completely changes the way the story is seen. Sleep does not need to be interpreted as a punishment or a mistake. It can be a silent choice, a detachment from reality of one's own free will. This is frightening because it shows that sometimes what seems like a loss can be a liberation. When we talk about deep sleep, many people imagine a void, a dark, formless space where nothing happens. But what if, instead, what Aurora found when she fell asleep was another kind of reality? A place where everything seemed lighter, more beautiful, safer. a world different from the real one that followed different rules and was shaped by its own desires. There is an idea that while we sleep, our mind creates spaces that exist only for us. These are called dream worlds, and in these worlds, the dreamer may have more control than they imagine. In Aurora's case, perhaps she did not simply enter an ordinary dream, but rather a type of reality where she had control over everything, as if that place was tailor-made for her. In this space, she did not have to follow orders. She did not have to please anyone. There were no rules imposed by other people. She was the one who decided what happened. This may have been the main reason why she did not want to wake up anymore. After all, why return to a world where you feel limited when you can remain in one where everything seems to work your way? This idea also shows something disturbing. If Aurora had control within this dream world, then she was not just a dreamer. She was an active presence. She could alter the environment, influence what was happening, and perhaps even affect other minds that were sleeping at the same time. It was not just a refuge, it was a place where she exercised power. Over time, this type of control can change. A person, someone who has always been guided by others, upon discovering that they can command everything in a new world, will hardly want to give it up. The dream turns into dominance, tranquility turns into authority, and what seemed like just a deep sleep reveals itself as the construction of a new reality, where Aurora is the one at the center of everything. For a long time, it was believed that Aurora's sleep could only be interrupted by a symbolic gesture, a kiss of true love. This led several people to try to wake her, especially princes and important figures, who saw the mission of waking her up as a test of courage or even a way to gain power. But what no one expected was that this quest would become a path of no return. With each attempt to get closer, something strange happened. The men who tried to wake her up did not return. Some simply disappeared. Others were found in a state of shock, unable to speak, as if they had seen something impossible to explain. What seemed like a noble mission began to turn into a real risk. It was no longer just about trying to wake someone up. It was as if there was something around Aurora that reacted strongly to these attempts. This reaction was not physical. There were no monsters or visible barriers, but there was a kind of invisible presence, something that messed with the minds of those who approached. Some reports spoke of voices, visions, or intense feelings of fear, as if the very space around her was protecting her sleep, as if that dream world where she now reigned did not allow interruptions from outside. Over time, people began to realize that trying to wake her up was not an act of love, but a dangerous challenge, something that could cost the sanity or even the life of those who insisted. What was once seen as a gesture of hope began to be avoided, and little by little, Aurora was left alone. Not out of respect, but out of fear. This change in behavior reveals something important. Aurora's sleep stopped being a simple curse and became a limit, a silent warning that this state should not be broken. And the more they tried to invade this space, the clearer it became that she was not defenseless. She was protected by something that no one could fully understand. As time passed, while Aurora remained asleep, something began to change outside. The castle where she slept was no longer a symbol of beauty and protection. Little by little, it began to transform. The walls that were once clean and well-kept began to darken. Vegetation took over everything. The flowers withered, the ground became damp, the stones began to loosen. It was as if the place was being forgotten, even with the princess still inside. This kind of change does not happen just because time passed. There was something different about that decay. The air inside the castle became heavy. People who entered reported chills, discomfort, sensations that were difficult to explain. Some said they heard whispers in the hallways. Others felt like they were being watched, No one could stay there for long without feeling that something was wrong. Even so, no one had the courage to take Aurora away. The fear of disturbing her sleep or provoking some unknown reaction made everyone move away little by little. Servants, advisors, and guards abandoned the castle, first as a precaution, then out of pure instinct. It was as if the environment itself was expelling any life form that tried to get close. This abandonment made the castle isolated from the rest of the world. There was no longer any talk of visitors, nor of the hope of waking the princess. The place became a kind of taboo, something that was talked about in whispers, but that no one really wanted to face. And the most disturbing thing was that, even in the midst of the destruction, the room where Aurora slept remained intact. No cracks, no sign of deterioration. It was as if that space was frozen in time, while everything around it was falling apart. This difference between what rotted and what remained preserved reinforces the idea that her sleep was not natural. There was a force keeping everything that way. And perhaps the more time passed, the clearer it became that Aurora wasn't just sleeping. She was being kept in that state by something much greater than anyone could control. At first, it seemed that Aurora was completely disconnected from the world around her. She slept silently, giving no signs of life. But over time, something strange began to happen. People close to the castle began to report frequent dreams about her. In some cases, these people had never seen the princess in person, but they said they could describe her face perfectly. These dreams were not common. They were intense, repetitive, and seemed increasingly real. Some said they heard Aurora's voice calling to them. Others claimed to see images of places they had never visited, but which they recognized as part of the castle. Little by little, it became clear that there was a connection between her deep sleep and the minds of those who were still awake. The situation began to worsen when these people changed their behavior. Some became more distant, others completely isolated themselves. There were cases of people sleeping for long periods of time and waking up with the feeling that they had lived for days inside a dream. This gave rise to a new theory. Aurora was not just dreaming. She was influencing the dreams of others. It was as if she were extending her dream world outside of herself. This interference began subtly, but it grew stronger. People outside the castle in other regions began reporting the same types of dreams. It didn't matter how far away. Her influence was spreading, and the more people she was affected, the more fear grew. Because what seemed to be just a mental connection began to have an impact on the real world. Some individuals reported time lapses, memory loss, or even physical sensations caused by experiences lived only during sleep. Aurora was blurring the line between what is dream and what is reality. She was reaching out to the outside world without even opening her eyes. This made it clear that her sleep was not passive. She was not just living in another world. She was building bridges between this world and ours. And with each mind she touched, her control grew. As time went by, Aurora's image was no longer just that of a sleeping princess. People began to see her in a different light. Many began to believe that her sleep was not just a curse, but a sign of something sacred. They began to treat her as if she were some kind of saint, someone with a greater purpose, beyond common understanding. This type of thinking grew quickly. People traveled from far away to get closer to the castle. Even with its decaying appearance and heavy atmosphere, they wanted to get as close as possible to the room where Aurora slept. They remained silent, prayed, left objects as offerings. Some even spent entire nights outside, hoping to dream of her. Aurora's image became a symbol of faith for many, and as these dreams about her continued to spread, the idea that she had some kind of power grew stronger and stronger. She began to be seen as a bridge between the physical world and the world of dreams, not as a victim, but as someone who has reached a state beyond the natural. Over time, small groups of people dedicated exclusively to her emerged. They weren't just admirers, they were devotees. They formed rituals, repeated phrases they supposedly heard in their dreams, and even wore clothes similar to those they saw Aurora wearing. They believed that she was alive on another plane, and that by connecting with her, they could also escape the pain of the real world. These practices grew, and what began as devotion became worship. People stopped living their lives to try to achieve this same sleep. Some stopped eating, others stopped talking. There were even those who tried to induce their own deep sleep, hoping to be accepted in the world where they believed Aurora reigned. At this point, she was no longer remembered only as a princess. For many, she had become an entity, a being that went beyond the idea of humanity, someone who had transcended the physical body and dominated something greater. And the more she was worshipped, the stronger her presence seemed to become in the dreams of those who believed in her. As Aurora's influence on people's dreams grew, a new situation began to emerge. More and more individuals reported that when they slept, they had difficulty waking up. It wasn't just a feeling of tiredness, it was as if something was holding them back from sleep. Some people took hours to wake up, others simply didn't. Wake up. Doctors, scholars, and religious people began to investigate these cases, but nothing made sense. There were no signs of illness or clear physical explanations. The only thing in common was that all of these people dreamed of Aurora before. They lost touch with reality. It was as if she were calling, inviting, or pulling their minds into the space where she herself had been for so long. This generated fear. Many began to avoid sleep. They would stay awake for days, afraid of falling asleep and not being able to return. Families took turns keeping loved ones awake. But the human body can't survive for long without rest. And once a person finally fell asleep, the risk was there. No one was sure if they would open their eyes again. This situation became known to some as a second curse, not cast by a fairy but created by Aurora's own presence in people's dreams. What was once seen as a state of peace or a symbol of faith began to be feared. Now, sleep had become dangerous. A simple natural act could cause someone to disappear from reality. The line between the physical world and the world of dreams was increasingly blurred. It was as if Aurora was expanding the boundaries of the place where she ruled. And in doing so, she created invisible traps that trapped people where no one else could reach them. This new curse was not announced with words. There was no visible spell. It was silent, gradual, and almost impossible to avoid. And the more minds lost within this space, the clearer it became that Aurora was not alone in that world. She was creating a kind of kingdom, a place where she decided who stayed and who returned. With so many people being affected by the dreams and deep sleep linked to Aurora, some began to believe that the only way to stop everything would be to interrupt the source of the phenomenon. This idea led to an extreme decision, destroying her body. It was a radical measure, but for some, it seemed like the only possible way out. The plan was simple. If Aurora was really at the center of everything, then eliminating her physical body could break the cycle. It was not certain whether it would work, but the situation had reached a point where people were willing to take risks. Even so, no one wanted to take on this responsibility alone. The fear was great. Many believed that touching her body could have serious consequences. After much debate, a group approached the castle to carry out the action. But something happened the moment they tried to enter the room where Aurora slept. The environment changed. The air became dense, the temperature dropped, and a feeling of pressure took over the place. Some fainted before even reaching the door. Others lost track of time and woke up in different places in the castle without remembering how they got there. In the end, no one was able to even get close to her, and the scariest thing happened right after. Everyone who took part in the attempt began to sleep soundly for the next few days. One by one, they fell into a deep sleep and never woke up again. It was as if Aurora had sensed the threat and reacted before anything happened. The entire castle was taken over by this new state. Visitors, residents, and even people who lived nearby began to fall into the same kind of sleep. It wasn't immediate, it happened gradually, but in a short time, the place became completely silent, as if it had been swallowed by a collective sleep. This attempt made it clear that this was no longer just an ancient curse. Aurora was now part of something much bigger, something that could not be controlled by ordinary means. Trying to eliminate her body did not bring liberation. On the contrary, it seemed to have further strengthened what was already out of control. After everything that had happened, the castle fell into absolute silence. Aurora was still there, sleeping in the same room, in the same state, untouched by time. But now, she was no longer just a forgotten figure from an old tale. She had become part of something much bigger. Her influence spread to distant places, affecting people who had never been near her. Stories began to emerge from various regions. People of different ages and places described the same dream. A dark room, a figure lying down, a whisper calling their names. None of these people could explain why, but they all woke up with the same feeling that someone was watching them even after they opened their eyes. These dreams did not follow normal patterns. They were not random, nor did they seem like simple creations of the mind. There was a constant presence, something that guided the dream, that created the details with unusual clarity. For some people, this happened only once. For others, it was frequent. The doubt began to grow. What if Aurora was no longer limited to the castle? What if her sleep was now connected to anyone, anywhere? The question that many avoid asking is simple, but disturbing. What if you are also within her reach? What if one night she appears in your dreams? The idea is frightening because there is no way to predict. There is no way to escape something that enters your mind while you sleep. And the most disturbing thing of all is that no one knows what Aurora really wants. She remains silent. She never answers, never explains. She just observes. And that makes each new dream a risk. Because maybe the next person not to wake up will be you. The end of this story is not an end. It is an invisible continuation, something that spreads slowly, silently. Aurora does not need to open her eyes to reach you. She has already found another path, and maybe you have already been touched by it without realizing it. Now that you have seen everything, you know that Sleeping Beauty's sleep was not just a curse, it was much more than that. She created a world within her dreams, and maybe that world is growing. So pay attention, because the next person to dream about her could be you, and if that happens, remember one thing. Not every dream has an end, and not everyone wakes up.